Writing is hard. And making characters jump off the page is hard. It's hard when they're made up. It's even harder when they're real and you have to pull them from history. And I fell in love with a historical character. He's in some of your wallets. He's on the $10 bill. His name is Alexander Hamilton. And I fell in love with him because of a book by Ron Chernow. Ron Chernow does what fiction writers do, but he has the voice of a novelist. He makes Alexander Hamilton seem as real as Jay Gatsby, or in my case, as jump off the page like Tupac Shakur, or a hologram of Tupac Shakur. And he makes history come alive. And when I read his book of Hamilton, my first thought was, why has no one turned this into a hip-hop musical? This guy wrote his way out of his circumstances. He was born penniless in Nevis, was orphaned by age 10, wrote so well that people took up a scholarship to send him to the mainland, caught beef with every other founding father, and was shot by the vice president in Weehawken, New Jersey. That's right, Dick Cheney was not the first vice president to shoot a guy. It's true. And I'm thrilled to be able to honor him. He was honored last year with the Pulitzer Prize for his biography of Washington, and tonight he gets the 2012 Janus Prize. Mr. Ron Chernow.
Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. I knew that this would happen to me someday, that I would have to follow Lin-Manuel Miranda, Sam Waterston, Anne Hathaway et al. I will do my best to soldier on. But no, seriously, it's a thrill to be honored before such a glittering gathering and by a periodical, Lapham's Quarterly, that manages to be sophisticated, erudite, and luxurious to the touch all at once. And especially thrilled to be introduced by my talented friend Lin-Manuel Miranda. I confess that when Lin first told me that he was going to do a hip-hop version of Hamilton's life, I was, shall we say, a bit dubious. Hip-hop Hamilton sounded suspiciously like a contradiction in terms to me. Well, thank God Lin persevered despite my doubts, and he has turned me into a total convert, convincing me that the passionate urgency of hip-hop suits the turbulent genius of Alexander Hamilton particularly well. Now, some of you may associate me with my recent tomes on Hamilton and Washington, and indeed I toiled for 12 years in the vineyard of the 18th century before starting my current project on Ulysses S. Grant. I feared that if I lingered any longer in the 18th century, I was going to start wearing wigs and buckle shoes and signing my letters with quill pens, your most obedient, humble servant. But as some of you know, my earlier books, such as The House of Morgan, The Warburgs, and Titan, The Life of John D. Rockefeller, dealt extensively with the 1920s, earning me a place, if just barely, in tonight's thematic festivities. Now, you know, they were doing lots of creative things on Wall Street in the 1920s. It seemed rather heartless to a lot of brokers to force investors to pay purely in cash for their stocks. So these very considerate brokers allowed people to put 10% down and to buy the rest on margin. And speculators, far from being curbed in this giddy decade, this was, after all, the heyday of free market capitalism, speculators were allowed to rig stocks openly in groups that were called pools, actually the way that Joseph P. Kennedy got his start. Pools were considered not criminal operations, but rather chic affairs by the investing public. And then mutual funds were introduced that bought other mutual funds in an endless chain of leverage and speculation. This was all one great big bag of hot air that was destined to burst in October 1929. Now, when I was researching the House of Morgan, I used to love to browse through the memoirs of various young stockbrokers of the 1920s. And in one of them, the young broker related how when he got his job, his boss forced him to adopt a then novel technique called cold calling. That is, picking up the telephone, calling a perfect stranger, and pressuring the total stranger to buy stocks. Well, the young broker wanted to find out how it was done, so one day he eavesdropped on a more experienced broker, and he heard this broker calling someone on the phone, and the older broker was told that the person that he was calling had just dropped dead. And the older broker, without missing a beat, promptly said, "Can I please speak to the next of kin?" That will give you a little bit of the flavor of the decade on Wall Street. Now, humor abounded during the bull market, and if anything, was spurred to new heights by the crash, when rumors circulated at the New York Stock Exchange that two investors had jumped from the identical ledge. Wags on the trading floor joked that they had shared a joint account. This is true. It turned out to be the great misfortune of Wall Street that some of America's foremost comedians counted among the leading casualties of the 1929 crash. One of them, you may know, was Groucho Marx, who used to call his broker every day when stocks were rising, but as the song goes, beware when they start to descend. Groucho's life savings were completely wiped out in the crash, and he liked to quip that his broker would actually have lost a lot more of his money, but that was all that he had. Coincidentally, in 1929, the Marx Brothers were doing Animal Crackers on Broadway by night, and by day they were filming The Coconuts at the Paramount studio here in Astoria. Now, for those of you who know the history of the decade, you realize that The Coconuts is actually a rather wicked spoof of the Florida land craze of the mid-1920s that, in fact, previewed the Wall Street mania of just a few years later. Groucho obviously did not heed the message of his own movie. You will also be grimly amused to learn that one of the main firms tarnished by the '29 crash was, yes, Goldman Sachs. When Goldman's flagship mutual fund, the Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation, went belly up, it managed to drag down with it 40,000 miserable investors. Unluckily for Goldman, one of the investors was Eddie Cantor, a man who did not go quietly. Cantor was then starring on Broadway in Whoopi, rather ironically named show to have on October 1929. And Cantor, after the demise of the Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation, not only did he file a $100 million lawsuit against Goldman Sachs, but he worked the firm rather mercilessly into his vaudeville routine. What he would do is he would have a stooge walk out onto the stage, viciously ringing a lemon, and Cantor would go up to the stooge and said, "Who are you?" And the stooge would snap, "I'm the margin clerk for Goldman Sachs," and then he would continue walking across the stage, squeezing his lemon. Eddie Cantor was an absolute master of the gallows humor that flourished in the wake of the crash. You may know that right after Black Thursday and Tragic Tuesday, John D. Rockefeller issued a famous statement from the privacy of his Pocantico estate. It was designed to reassure shaken investors. This is what Rockefeller said. Quote, "Believing that fundamental conditions of the economy are sound, my son and I have for some days been purchasing sound common stocks." Well, when the reporters heard this, they all rushed to Eddie Cantor for a reaction to Rockefeller's statement that he was buying, and Eddie Cantor shot back, "Sure, who else has any money left?" So much for Rockefeller's reassurance. Well, in the aftermath of our own crash, and God, how I wish sometimes that we had those wits of the 1920s around to lampoon and lambaste the responsible bankers today, I want to thank you all for contributing whatever spare cash you had left over after 2008 to Lapham's Quarterly. And I thank you. And I thank you most of all for Louis and company for honoring me as part of this effervescent evening that I think, if it has proven nothing else, it has proven that wit and taste are not, in fact, entirely dead in our own decade either. Thank you.